Okay, so here we are. The nervous system has two main divisions, kind of two categories with them. What are those?
The CNS.
CNS and PNS. So CNS is the central nervous system, and the peripheral is the PNS. And so central has two main parts, the brain and spinal cord. And we're going to learn that there are special neurons that are just within the central nervous system called interneurons. Neurons are your basic cell for the nervous system. So then your peripheral nervous system is basically the part of your nervous system that takes information to and from your central nervous system. So the two parts have to do with if the neurons are taking information to the central nervous system or away from it. So what do we call when information is going to the central nervous system? What part of your nervous system is that? Sensory something, absolutely. So we have our sensory kind of division. They also call this afferent or afferent. And so this is the sensory here, sensory or, and this is, so this takes information to your central nervous system. So this would be like sensory neurons. At the ends, take information from the ends of your fingertips from touching something pointy or hot, and it takes the information to your central nervous system. So this involves what we call sensory neurons. And so I'll put here, takes info to the CNS. And that's what it does there. Versus the other part of your peripheral nervous system, the other part is once your sensory neurons take information to the brain and the spinal cord, the brain and spinal cord sends information back out to through your peripheral nervous system. This is called your motor division or afferent. So this involves what we call motor neurons. And this takes information from your central nervous system to what we call, in the generic place, is the effector. What that means is when that neuron takes the information from your central nervous system to that effector, it's going to cause a change to happen there. All right, so then your motor division subcategorizes into two divisions based upon what it's communicating with and whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary. Do you know what they are? Yeah, the involuntary is your ANS, or A stands for autonomic. I'll just put NS for nervous system. And as she said there, that is involuntary. So if it's involuntary, and we just said that the motor division, the neurons take information from the central nervous system to the effector. What would be, in this case here, the neurons that are part of the autonomic nervous system, what would they be communicating with? What would be the effectors here?
Maybe like glands or hormones?
Yeah, glands. All right, so I should write the effector here is glands, which could stimulate to release hormones and things like that. What else?
Like, heartbeat and stuff.
Heartbeat, yeah, and that's a special kind of muscle that we can control called cardiac. So the factors are glands, cardiac, and the other type of muscle is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle surrounds your organs, like of your digestive system and so on, around your stomach and so on. And so those are things that we can't control. All right, so that's your autonomic nervous system. What's the one over here that's voluntary?
Somatic.
Yeah, this is your somatic nervous system. So the voluntary is somatic. And here, what are your effector cells? Effector organ or tissue? This is your skeletal muscle. So this is going to cause your muscles to contract and move your skeleton. And we can definitely control that. Then the last thing we have to do is look at with the involuntary or the autonomic nervous system, we can subcategorize that into two.
Sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is, one of these is involved with using energy. So, and involved, so you're performing an action and you need energy, so it increases your heart rate, increases your breathing rate, stimulates your liver to break down glycogen. The other one is just maybe under normal conditions where you're conserving energy. So which one's which? Which one's the take action, use energy? Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Maria?
The sympathetic is the speeds things up. Right?
Yeah. Speeds things up, yeah. So I use the example with the fight or flight response. So, and releasing epinephrine, which is adrenaline, which increases your heart rate, increases your breathing rate, stimulates the breakdown of glycogen and the glucose to use for energy. And the parasympathetic we talked about, use the example of rest and digest, where you're kind of conserving energy under normal kind of housekeeping conditions for the body, and slowing down. So that's that. So what we're going to look at today is parts of the central nervous system and parts of the peripheral nervous system and the organs that are involved. So we're going to talk about parts of the brain and so on. But I want to talk a minute about the connections between this. So this kind of is the breakdown. So the sensory division here is part of the peripheral nervous system, but does it interact with the central nervous system? Absolutely. So I'm going to put a different color to show kind of like communication. So this is not, so this is a little bit different, but I want to show you here that this part of the peripheral nervous system, the sensory neurons, take information from the environment and they communicate them to the central nervous system. So this in red is communication, not like the breakdown of how, right? So then the central nervous system then sends information back to the peripheral nervous system, but not to the sensory division. It's going to send information to the motor division. Now the motor division, once it gets there, it's going to either communicate with your involuntary muscles or glands, or your voluntary. So there's a choice to be made. So here or here. So this is kind of the communication, and eventually it can cause the skeletal muscles to contract, or cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle, and so on. And so that's kind of the communication route and the connection between and how information moves between peripheral nervous peripheral, central, and back to peripheral nervous system to cause a change to happen. All right? So where we're going to start here today is with the central nervous system and the brain and spinal cord. I'm going to show you some different parts of the central nervous system. Alright, so this I think is where we are at. So, this is where we're at? Underneath the big cells. Alright, so the central nervous system links sensory and motor functions of the peripheral nervous system together. So you have the spinal cord integrating simple responses and carrying information to and from the brain. Your brain is on top of your spinal cord and is the center of controlling homeostasis, keeping a constant internal environment, perception, movement, intellect, and emotions. So we're going to look at the vertebrate brain. So this would be like our brain, and there's three main parts there. It says forebrain, which is the cerebrum. Midbrain is the senses visual and olfactory stimuli. What does olfactory mean? Smell. This is smell, so you might want to jot that down here. The hindbrain controls involuntary actions. So let's look at the forebrain here a little bit more, or the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the center of intelligence. There are two hemispheres that you've probably heard of, the left and the right. Left is involved speech, language, and calculation. The right is artistic ability and spatial perception. And they can communicate through the corpus callosum. Both hemispheres have 4 lobes: the frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal. They all have different functions. Contain primary sensory areas and association areas. So, for example, parts of the frontal and temporal lobes are important for generation and understanding of language. And you have the cerebellum, coordinates balance, motor, perceptual, and cognitive functions. The thalamus, where sensory and motor information passes to and from the cerebrum. And the hypothalamus helps to regulate internal environment. Regulates what's called the pituitary gland. Different behaviors such as hunger, thirst, and rage. All right, so let's look at a couple of things. If you look at, I'm going to come back to that last bullet, but if you look at the next page, you have a couple of pictures there. And the second one says major internal parts of the human brain. And so this part right here that a lot of people think of, as the brain, this is, because I don't think it says here, no. Oh, it says, this right here is called the cerebrum. This is whole kind of part. And when we look at the cerebrum, so we just wrote about the cerebrum, it says it has 2 hemispheres. And so notice here, like this would be like if this would be like my brain. So you're looking at just one side of the person. And so this would be the left hemisphere, or the left part of the brain that we'd be looking at here. And if you looked at this, and for some reason I didn't put this as part of your notes here, but if you look at the top part, so this would be like if you're looking behind, all right, look from the top and kind of behind. There's two parts of the brain. There's the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. And they communicate through this area called the corpus callosum, which is shown here as well. So there's this area of communication where your two halves of that brain, the cerebrum, can communicate with one another. Underneath here, you have on the base here, this is the cerebellum. And so that is this right here. So the cerebellum here, and as we just wrote here, helps with balance and perception, certain cognitive functions, and so on. So this is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum. Then it talks about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which is kind of hard to see on this picture here. They're not labeled. So they're right in this interior region here, would be right about right here. The right in here would be the hypothalamus and the thalamus. I just wanted to show you kind of in connection with everything else there. So there are parts of that. And they both release hormones that help to regulate internal environment and so on. So your hypothalamus helps with regulating temperature and body temperature. That's an example of regulating internal environment. So let's write that down here. So example is temperature. So back when we talked about positive and negative feedback, one of the packets was about body temperature, and hypothalamus was part of that with regulating body temperature, and therefore sending out certain hormones if you're too hot to allow you to sweat, all right, and if you're too cold, it induces shivering, and so on. And so that's an example of that. Now, if we look at the cerebrum here, so there's two hemispheres, and then each hemisphere have 4 lobes. And so that's what this picture here is showing you. So you have this picture above. So on this picture here shows you, again, looking at, in this case here would be the left hemisphere, 4 different lobes. Mine are color-coded. Obviously yours are not, but you can see where they're separated, and there are 4 names. And then they put on this is from your textbook, so it's figure 48.27, and it shows you what each of some major things that each of the lobes are involved in. And so, so looking at here with the frontal lobe, speech and the motor cortex is involved in movements. Again, another area of speech here with the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe, basically vision. Temporal lobe is both hearing and a little bit of smell here as well. So I'm going to want you to know kind of the basics of what those lobes kind of are involved in. All right, so, and that different parts of the brain are specialized for different sensory input and interpretation. All right, so that's part of the cerebrum. All right, now the brain is sitting on what we call the brainstem. So now you have to go back to that last bullet. This is part of the brainstem. The brainstem has 3 parts. The medulla oblongata, midbrain, and pons. And so just put some collective things on here. They're involved in regulating breathing and heart rate. Heartbeat. Connect sensory and motor signals between your spinal cord and your brain. The signals literally have to go through the brain stem to get from your spinal cord to your brain or vice versa. They also help regulate sleep and arousal. So if we look back at this picture here, back to this picture, this is your brainstem right here, and so these three things right here comprise your brainstem. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. That should say oblongata, it got cut off. So that's this part right here. Mine is kind of color-coded here. So it has the three lines to the three parts here. And so notice that your brain is kind of sitting on this brainstem, and on the other side, this right here is your spinal cord. So when it says that your brainstem, kind of controls back and forth signals to and from the spinal cord in your brain, that's why. All right, so they literally have to pass through there. So the sensory neurons, when we say it communicates to the central nervous system, you might have a sensory neuron that goes to your spinal cord. Then there's another neuron that can go up to your brain, and then back and go out through a motor neuron to a skeletal muscle or so on. And so when that sensory neuron takes the information to the spinal cord, the information has to pass through the brainstem to get to and be interpreted by the appropriate lobe in the cerebellum. All right? And that is the central nervous system, or what you kind of need to know. So it's kind of like a memorization thing about what parts do what for the brain and the spinal cord. So the rest of this, we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system. So then your central nervous system communicates then specifically with the motor division of your peripheral nervous system. So either the somatic, which is going to cause the contraction of your skeletal muscles, is voluntary, and we'll talk about reflexes here in a second, and that, or your autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary for those involuntary muscles. And then, of course, depending upon what's going on, involve the sympathetic or parasympathetic underneath the autonomic nervous system, either involving the use of energy or conserving energy. So let's talk about how they communicate with one another then. So this was the beginning part of your homework over the weekend, was about the structure of neurons. So neurons are nerve cells that form the nervous system. They react to environmental stimuli in specific ways. Dendrites are areas that receive signals or receive information from the stimuli. The signals move from the dendrite to the body of the cell body. And then you have axons that are long that take information from the cell body to the end of the cell. The end of the cell is called the axon terminal or synaptic bulb or synaptic terminal. All of those things mean the same thing. Now, a lot of neurons have these what are called Schwann cells. Schwann cells form, we're going to see they make myelin, which forms an insulating layer. And so what happens is, if we look at this, this is one Schwann cell around the axon. So here's the axon here. And the Schwann cell, you guys having fun saying Schwann? I hear some people. So this axon, which was part of the cell body and then comes over, this axon goes right down the center of the Schwann cells. And so the axon is there. Now notice the Schwann cells do not butt up right next to each other. So here's the end of one and here's the end of the other. So you have these small areas where the axon of the neuron is exposed. And that small area is what we call the node of Ranvier from the French scientists who discovered them. And so the axon, I'm going to put here nodes of Ranvier, I'm going to put axon is exposed here. This is really important that the axon is exposed at that particular area. So that's your basic idea there of the neuron and what it looks like. Not all neurons look exactly like this. We'll see in just a little bit here, but that's just a general picture. I do want to point out a couple of things here. Notice here it says dendrite of the next neuron. So here is the dendrite of the next neuron, which means the dendrite is going to communicate with the cell body. So this is the cell body of the next neuron, and then it's going to have an axon, and so on and so forth. There's space here. These cells aren't touching one another. So what happens is the dendrites receive the signal. So this receives the signal. The signal goes to the cell body, down the axon, to the synaptic terminal. This area where this cell is going to communicate with this cell is called the synapse. They're not touching here. And so what we're going to see is most neurons, or a lot of neurons, release chemicals called neurotransmitters that bind to receptors on the next cell's membrane, which stimulates a change to happen. The signal can move down that cell. And so that's what's called the synapse. And so that's what that picture, that bottom part of the picture is showing you here. So this right here is showing you, you have this picture too, showing you this. I'm going to introduce a couple of new things here with this picture though. Here, this cell is communicating with this cell. How do I know that? The signal direction. So they have the signal direction here. And so therefore, and we know that signals are always taken in by the dendrites. And so therefore, here's the receives the signal. This could be, if this is let's say a sensory neuron, it has receptors in the membrane of the dendrites to sense changes in pressure or temperature, and then that triggers the signal to go to the cell body, down the axon, and to the synaptic terminals, where it's going to communicate with the next cell, which then will send the signal down and communicate with the next cell, and so on and so forth. This is the new wording here, presynaptic and postsynaptic cell. So pre means before, right? Post means after. It says pre and postsynaptic. What are we talking about? The synapse. So this is where the communication between this cell and this cell is occurring. And so this presynaptic cell sends the signal to the postsynaptic cell. That transfer of signal occurs at this synapse. So your signal direction. And then you get your postsynaptic cell. This receives the signal. From what? Presynaptic cell. And we're calling it pre and post depending in relationship to where that communication is occurring. Let me ask you this. Let's say that there's another neuron here. So let's say here's the dendrites of the next neuron coming out here, and here's the axon, all right, and then and so on and so forth, the Schwann cells. All right, this is a new synapse here. This cell, in communicating with this cell, becomes the what? Presynaptic, and this is now the postsynaptic. All right, so it's always in relationship to the communication at the synapse that we're talking about. Absolutely. All right, and so, notice here it says here myelin sheath. The myelin. Let me show you here why they call it myelin. This you don't have this picture of, but I just want to show it to you because I like it. It shows the cross section of this. If we were to actually take the Schwann cell and chop it in half so we see the cross section, here's the axon. The Schwann cell, it's an actual cell with a nucleus that wraps around the axon. So this right here is the cell. It's wrapped around the axon. It's in light blue here. And the Schwann cell makes myelin, which is a molecule that, this is what we say, insulates the axon, all right, forming these layers here. So the dark here is the myelin here. So that's why we have Schwann cells, but we call that collectively with the Schwann cells here, that's why we call it a myelin sheath. And we're going to see that the myelin is really, really important as the signal goes down the axon. Going back to this picture, it says signal direction from the cell body to the synaptic terminal. Actually, the myelin, whoops, accidentally hit the wrong thing. The myelin, when the signal goes down here, allows the signal to kind of jump from node to node. And what that does is makes this myelin sheath makes the signal go down the axon much quicker, which means that the communication occurs much quicker. And so myelin sheath is very, very important in speed of the transmission of the signal. All right, so let's move on with the neurons here. So neural impulses are transmitted both electrically and chemically. They move from the environment to the brain to the effector via these three different types of neurons. The sensory neuron, which we talked about here, receives the stimulus from a sense organ, such as the eyes and ears, or from another neuron, takes the information to the central nervous system, where you have what are called association or interneurons. Reside only within the brain and spinal cord. Receives sensory stimuli and transfers information directly to a motor neuron or to the brain for processing. And then your motor neuron is back over here in the motor division. So when we wrote up here on this big picture here where the sensory neurons take information to the central nervous system, the cell that's only in the central nervous system are interneurons or association neurons. So we wrote sensory and motor neurons for these guys. Interneurons are only in the central nervous system. So when sensory neurons take information to the brain and spinal cord, it relays that information to interneurons within there. So you have this picture that illustrates this. This picture is of the knee-jerk reflex that I'm sure everybody in here has had happen to them at the doctor's office when they hit your knee with a hammer, a small hammer, and it's so bad, whack you with a hammer, and it triggers a reflex that you don't even think about. So, so what's going on in this, and how does this relate to sensory motor interneurons in the spinal and the central nervous system? So here we have you relax. And so there are two muscles here, quadriceps and your hamstring. So what happens is when the hammer hits, you hit a tendon that causes a stretch in your hamstring muscles. What you get here is, mine is color-coded blue here, but this neuron right here, I want to talk about its construction here. This is a sensory neuron, so hence the blue here. So it's going to take information from the environment and take it to the central nervous system. That's what sensory neurons do. So look at here. So here's your quadricep, the stretch. Here's your sensory neuron. This sensory neuron looks different than the last picture of the neuron that we looked at. The generic kind of pictures of neurons look like this, where you have the dendrites from the cell body and you have one long axon, and so the information goes down to the synaptic terminals. This looks different. The cell body's right here, and you have two long parts coming off of it. Which one's the dendrite? Where are the dendrites at?
Go back.
On the quadricep. What tells me that?
Receiving
It's receiving, and I know that impulse is going that, the direction is going that way. So if this is the cell body, remember that information from the environment always travels to the cell body, and then away, the axon, so this is the axon, these are the dendrites. Axon always takes information away from the cell body, all right? And so that's what we see here. So the signal is going in this direction. And so it's sent, in this case here, there are receptors in the membrane of the dendrites that sense that stretch of the quadricep muscle, takes the information, it enters through the axon into the spinal cord. So this is a cross section of your spinal cord. Notice the axon divides into two ends here. There's two synaptic terminals. So this one sensory neuron can communicate simultaneously with two neurons. And so the two neurons it's communicating with, one is an interneuron. The interneuron here, how do I know it's an interneuron? It's only found in the brain and the spinal cord. So this is your interneuron here, and it doesn't leave the brain or the spinal cord. And then the second cell that it's communicating with is these synaptic terminals is a motor neuron. So this right here is a motor neuron. And what is that showing you? This right here is the cell body. The cell body would have dendrites coming off of it that will receive the information. And the signal goes to the quadriceps. And we know here that the signal is going through here. So this right here is a motor neuron. So what does this cause to happen? This is going to trigger the quadricep to do what? To contract. So this right here, this is going to causes quad to contract. And that's your end result of this loop here. But look at here, what's the purpose of this part right here? Why is it communicating also with an interneuron? And this interneuron is also communicating with another motor neuron. This is also a motor neuron. So what's up with that? All right, so what's going on here with this is that, notice that this one's communicating with a hamstring. So you have quadriceps and you have hamstrings. They're both skeletal muscles moving your skeleton. But you know what the relationship between them are? They do the opposite. They're called antagonistic muscles. All right, so they cause the opposite movement. If you have them both contracting at the same time, do you think you'll move? No. So when one is moving, the other one, or one is contracting, the other one can't contract, has to be relaxed, or vice versa. All right, so what's going on here is that this communication here through the interneuron, which communicates with this motor neuron, this is an inhibitory motor neuron. It's going to inhibit the hamstring muscle from contracting. So this motor neuron right here is going to, it's a stimulatory or excitatory neuron. It's going to cause this muscle to contract. So while the quadriceps are contracting, this one inhibits the hamstring muscle from contracting. So, and what makes it excitatory or inhibitory is the chemical that's released, the neurotransmitter that's released that can cause those to happen. All right, question.
Does the interneuron like switch like between inhibit and like call to contract or not? So like because it's coming from the same cell. So does the interneuron like switch it, saying instead of constricting, just use it out to why?
No, does it switch on and off in terms of could this make this excitatory? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Like and cause that? No, that would be another pathway. Because it would be another.
It'd be a whole different.
Yes, okay. Yes, absolutely.
So what's the purpose of the interneuron?
The purpose of the interneuron, yeah, it's just a communication. Well, I should say that the interneuron, according to this picture here, I should say that it also can branch and release different things to communicate with other cells as well. This picture doesn't show that here, but yeah, it's, so it's kind of a go-between in between the sensory and motor neuron, only found in the brain and the spinal cord. And notice here that, are we involving the brain at all? No. So this is what a reflex does, is you're not involving the brain at all, and so you are reacting before you can kind of interpret even what's going on, all right? Because that's what makes it happen so quickly.
And then another thing, what's the difference between the white matter, like does the white matter and gray matter have anything to do with it?
That has to do with where the cell bodies are, and where the axons are. For this class, though, we're not going to get into the detail with that. All right, so, all right. Question?
Yeah. Going back to the structure of a neuron, at the end of the myelin sheath, there are like little, they kind of look like dendrites, but I'm guessing they're not.
Which picture?
I mean any one really.
Okay.
Are those are snaps? Like I'm looking at this picture. This
Which
one.
picture?
Look, the other one. That one.
Yeah, I don't know about this. All right.
That one.
Yeah.
The word synapse is pointing at those little.
Right here.
Yeah, it's pointing at the dendrite-looking parts at the end of the myelin sheath, right?
No, like what that is if I were to redraw this,
Mhm.
all right, to look, so this part right here,
Yeah.
this part is coming from the end of this
Yep.
cell. So if I were to redraw this, so these are the what we call the synaptic terminals.
Okay.
It's the end of this cell.
Okay, I wasn't sure because it kind of got muddled in with the
Yes,
dendrites.
and so then this cell here, if I were to draw it here, this is the cell body with the
Okay,
dendrites. They're not actually connected together.
Okay,
And so what happens is this cell releases a signal to communicate with this cell on the
Okay.
dendrites in the next
Okay,
cell.
fair.
Okay? Okay? Okay, and so this is your reflex action. And so this kind of shows you the sensory going to the spinal cord, in this case, back to the peripheral, and your effector is your skeletal muscle. So this particular reflex action isn't involving your brain at all. All right? And so, so what I'd like you to do, what I'd like to do real quickly before we go on to the next is go refer back to your homework and look at the parts that we've covered so far, which is only the first few questions here. All right, so on your labeling a neuron diagram here, at your top, all right, the top one should be dendrites, all right, on the top left. All right, so those are the receiving. Then below that, you have a line pointing to the dark spot, and that's the nucleus. And then to the right of the dendrite, what that was supposed to be looking at is the cell body. All right, so the dendrites take information to the cell body. And then going from left to right on the next one to the right is down below, and it's pointing to, you could either have, there's different things, you could have a Schwann cell, you could have myelin, you could have the myelin sheath, all right, for that. All of that would not be incorrect. The next one to the right points to the little oval inside of that. That is, it's hard to see what exactly it is. It's either the nucleus or the Schwann cell or the Schwann cell nucleus. And so that's what that is. And then in between there, kind of in between the Schwann cells going to the top one coming off of there, you should have, that's your axon, or if you wrote note of Ranvier, that would be fine as well with that. And then at the very end, you have either the synaptic terminals, sometimes they're called synaptic bulbs, sometimes they're called axon terminals. All of those would be okay with that. So then for number 2, which structure in the diagram would receive a signal, that would be your dendrite. And when it asks you to draw an arrow, your arrow should be going from left to right on there. Okay? All righty. And we'll stop here. All right, so we'll pick up on this tomorrow.
Like before we were
Actually, yeah, here.
Well, if you want the notes, I have them.
I'm like, Sage, you have a choice to use this or not use this. Would you say no?
Oh, I'm stopping.